Welcome to Weekly News Review program where we look on the events of last week in Europe and beyond. I'm your host Martin. Today we are covering week of 19 to 25th January 2026 and let's look at what happened out there. Let's start with the most intense and observed event of beginning of this week. Donald Trump's plan to take over Greenland. Even though this clash started developing already in previous week, at the beginning, Donald Trump said that he's planning to impose tariffs on a number of European countries as well as the UK starting January 6th. This prompted a reaction from EU, which agreed on a meeting on a Thursday. However, these tensions were dissolved when the US president attended the Davos World Economic Forum, where he stepped back from his demand and instead proposed a framework of securing Greenland against possible invasion. Following this declaration, the NATO chief, Mark Rutte, said that this framework should be implemented, if not in the first half of 2026, by the end of the year. This definitely diluted the concern between Europe and America. However, the meeting eventually of the European countries eventually occurred. And result of this meeting were review of the Greenland situation as well as talks about other security issue concerning the European Union, specifically Ukraine. The major outcome of the meeting was that the European leaders agreed that the firm stand and diplomacy with US granted the current solution for the Greenland situation. This Thursday, the French government went not through one, but two votes of non-confidence. Each of the votes initiated by the opposite spectrum of the political map, by right extreme and left extreme. However, the motivation for both this non-confidence vote is that the current government is not able to gain enough votes to pass budget for this year through the lower house of parliament. And most probably, it will be necessary to trigger Article 49.3 of the Constitution, which will allow it to force the expenditure part of the budget through the National Assembly. This will trigger mostly additional non-confidence votes. This kind of instability in French politics is ongoing since the second half of last year, mostly due to very high debt of the French government and high spending mostly on social issues. Let's move to the next point. First trilateral meeting between Russia, US and Ukraine occurred on Friday and Saturday in Abu Dhabi. However, there was no significant progress in the peace talks, mainly on the topics of handing over of territory. Russia demands the entire region of Donbas, something what Vladimir Zelensky and the Ukrainian representation opposes, based on mainly 2 points. One, it's legal since Ukraine constitution doesn't allow handover of territory without referendum. And second, that they were fighting for this region very hardly in last 2 years. However, following the end of the two-day meeting, President Zelensky posted that another round of talks is possible shortly, maybe as shortly as next week. On the ground in Ukraine, unfortunately, the situation wasn't so relaxed since the nightly attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure by Russian continued. Number of power plants were hit and cities are without electricity, sometimes even multiple days. Main problem is that the repairs are not fast enough and blackouts are becoming more and more frequent around the countries. We'll still stay on the topics related to Ukraine and war in Ukraine, since two interesting events occurred this week, one in Berlin and second in Mediterranean Sea near Morocco. Let's start with the part of Berlin, where a Ukrainian German woman was arrested for spying for Russia, allegedly. She was named as Ilona W., and according to the information from the prosecutor, she was supposed to conduct espionage on behalf of the Russian Federation at least since 2023. Her main point was to create contacts with employees or former employees of Ministry of Defense and gather sensitive information on weapon supply to Ukraine. This information then were supposed to be handled to the Russian embassy, specifically to the defense attaché of the Russian embassy, who was already expelled by the German foreign ministry. Russia denies any kind of wrongdoing. The second event, Into the Sea, the French Navy, together with partners from Great Britain, intercepted a ship which is belonging to the Russian so-called Shadow fleet which helps to avoid sanctions imposed on Russia by the European Union and its allies. Ship called Grinch was intercepted between Morocco and Spain, and the French government claims that this is just flag of convenience and is transporting sanctioned oil from Russia. The ship is currently diverted to Marseille, where all maritime related crimes are handled in France. The French government stated that all was done in accordance with the international maritime law. This week was very dark for Spanish railway since four tragic accidents occurred. The first one and the biggest one occurred between Madrid and Malaga last Sunday, the 18th of January, where a high-speed train collided with another train heading the opposite direction. The death toll of this crash is 45 people, mainly from Spain. However, 3 women from Russia, Morocco, and Germany died as well. Tuesday, 2 other accidents occurred. One near Barcelona, where a train driver was killed by a support wall which collapsed. Second one in Catalonia, but luckily nobody was injured there. Tuesday as well marked the start of 3 days of mourning for the 45 victims of Sunday accident. On Thursday, a narrow gauge train collided with crane, but this incident resulted only in light injuries. It is necessary to mention Spain has one of the biggest high-speed rail networks around the world, preceded only by China, and this country was for a long time example of train safety and accessibility by train as ideal form of public transport. Current investigation into the tragic accident of Sunday the 18th suggests that fatigue in infrastructure was the cause for the accident. All of this leaves the Spanish travelers as well as employees of the railways uneasy about their next train ride. At the beginning of this week, the Syrian government forces overtook two-thirds of territory controlled by Syrian Democratic Forces, a Kurdish militia, in less than 2 days. It was a very swift attack. And this includes invasion of territory east of Euphrates River, as well as capturing oil fields. This occurred despite a ceasefire, which they agreed on last week. The Syrian Democratic Forces lost most territory with Arab majority, and this can be attributed to the fact that a number of local clans sided with the government and abandoned the Kurdish alliance. The current ceasefire is just implementation of mechanism which was agreed on the 10th of March 2025. But this rapid change brought unease all around Middle East since the Kurdish held area by the Syrian Democratic Forces hosts number of camps, prison camps, which holds the most brutal ISIS fighters and their families. As a result of these clashes, there was strain on the number of personnel guarding these camps, and number of escapes already occurred. For example, at Al-Shaddadi prison, the number of escapees varies from the source, starting from 150 to 1,000. As well as both sides, the Syrian government and the Syrian Democratic Forces, trade blame for these escapes. Trying to cool down the situation, Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara met with the SDF chief Moslem Abadi in Damascus on Monday. However, there was no clear result of their talks. Al-Shara, as well as called with US President Donald Trump to stress the need for Syrian unity. The fighting side agreed later this week on extension of the ceasefire for additional two weeks. All of this leaves Kurdish future under the new Syrian regime unclear, since so far no guarantees were offered besides some cultural rights. In addition to this, there are a number of protests in support of the Kurds around Europe, where there is a large Kurdish diaspora. And another unfortunate incident from Minneapolis on Saturday afternoon, a 37-year-old Alex Pretty was shot dead by the federal agents. The representative of the federal government claims that the agent was doing so in self-defense. This incident suggests another round of protests in Minneapolis and other areas of Michigan, where clashes with law enforcement occurred. Minnesota governor appealed to President Trump to remove ICE and other federal law enforcement from the city, since they claim that they are inciting violence. Trump reacted to this by saying that the governor incites insurgency against the central government in Washington and considers sending federal troops. Here we need to mention that the tensions between ICE and the citizen of Michigan is ongoing already for a while. News in one sentence. Italian fashion icon Valentino Gravani died on Monday in his house in Rome at the age of 93. Hungary's main opposition party, FISA, led over Viktor Orban Fidesz in January polls. Torrential rains caused damage and 2 deaths in Athens area of Greece. Former intelligence officer in Austria, Augusto Ott, went on trial for accused of helping Russia hunt down its opponents and selling government phones and secure laptops. At behalf of the fugitive former Wirecard executive Jan Marshallek. US sunk a ship in Eastern Pacific as a part of its anti-narco-terrorist campaign. You listen to Weekly News Review for the week of 19 to 25 January 2026. Thank you for listening to the first Weekly News Review. I hope you enjoyed it and will come back next week. We are recording in Bratislava. At the end of the first episode, please let me shortly introduce why I started this podcast and why now. I've been interested in global events for a while since my teenage years. However, I never put them together in a clear form. In current complex informational situation and world situation amplified by social media, it's great to have an anchor and place for clarity what's actually important. That's what motivated me to create this podcast. In short form, I will pick up the most interesting events, in my opinion, from around the world with main focus on Europe. Usually I use highly reliable sources as Deutsche Welle, Reuters, BBC, and other agencies. And from this, I pick the events and I will try in the upcoming episodes to explain why they were important for me. Thank you very much for listening.